Appalachian Mountains hold stories the way the rocks hold coal, buried deep, dark, and waiting for the right hands to dig them out. Some of those stories are sung in ballads by old women rocking on front porches. Some are carved into tombstones, standing crooked in forgotten cemeteries, and some are whispered so quietly around fires that you wonder if you imagined them. Among them, the tale of the forbidden daughter was one that even the boldest tongues hesitated to repeat. Folks said it was too dark, too shameful, too much of a reminder of how the wilderness could twist a soul when it lived too long without the company of God or neighbor. But still, the story endured, tucked in the hidden folds of the mountains, the hollows where light rarely touched, and the old cabins where secrets stayed longer than the people who built them. In one of those hollows, far beyond the reach of town bells and church hymns, stood a cabin where the smoke from the chimney rarely rose straight, always curling and bending as if the wind itself wanted to keep away. It belonged to the Whitaker family, a name that once carried respect back, when the grandfather had worked the mines and the grandmother had midwifed half the babies in the valley. But by the time the story that would stain them began, the Whitakers were only two, a father and his daughter. Her name, passed down through whispers, was Lila. Lila was born small, with eyes the color of storm clouds and hair that tangled no matter how often her grandmother combed it. People remembered her as quiet, always hovering behind her mother's skirt in town, peering at the world with a mix of curiosity and fear. When her mother died sudden, some said fever, some said childbirth, some said a broken heart, the father retreated to the cabin with Lila, shutting out the world as though it had nothing left to offer him. Neighbors came less and less, and soon they stopped coming at all. By the time Lila was 12, she and her father lived like ghosts, surfacing only to buy flour, salt, and kerosene, speaking little, looking no one in the eye. The mountains are both cradle and cage. They can nurture life in the soil, feed a man, with game and berries, wrap him in silence so thick that he forgets the world exists. But they can also close in on him, cut him off, whisper to him in voices only he can hear. For Lila's father, isolation settled heavy on his shoulders, and the grief he carried grew into something misshapen. Folks who remembered him in town said he was a tall man, proud once, with the sort of steady gaze that made people trust him. But grief hollows a man out like rot in a tree, and what was left was a shell, one that looked strong from the outside but cracked with the slightest pressure. It was in that cabin, under the eaves that dripped with rain, and beside the fire that barely held back winter, that the story took its first step into darkness. Lila grew into a young woman with a beauty that was sharp, almost painful to look at. She had her mother's cheekbones, her grandmother's eyes, and a softness about her that the mountains themselves seemed to envy. And in the silence of the cabin, where no preacher's word could reach, her father began to see her not as daughter, but as something else. The whispers claim Lila never cried out, never resisted, not because she wanted what came, but because she knew resistance was useless. The mountains had trapped her as surely as her father's shadow did. At night, the wind would rattle the boards, and the creek outside would roar, but inside, Lila's silence was heavier than either. When the first child came, she was barely 16. Folks who noticed her absence in town muttered about sickness, but no one dared to ask questions. When she returned, thinner, paler, and with eyes that would not lift from the ground, her father stood beside her, with a hardness that warned others away. In those days, superstition was a stronger shield than law. People believed the mountains, cursed families who broke God's rules, that children born of such sin carried marks, strange eyes, twisted limbs, a meanness in their nature. But with Lila's first child, there was no obvious mark. A boy, quiet as his mother, pale as the winter moon. His existence was explained away to strangers as the orphan of a distant cousin. Only the sharpest tongues in town whispered otherwise, and even they lowered their voices when the father's name was mentioned. The cabin grew heavier with secrets. Each season carried another burden, and each year Lila seemed to shrink, as though the walls themselves pressed tighter around her. Her father aged too, but his hold on her never loosened. What began as a single sin turned into a cycle, and soon, the hollow itself seemed to breathe with it. Neighbors who passed by said they felt watched, that the trees leaned closer, that the silence was not the silence of peace, but of dread. Folklore has a way of exaggerating, of painting the truth with shadows to make it larger than life. But when it comes to Lila Whitaker, even the plainest telling is enough to chill the blood. For she was not just a daughter in the mountains, she became a mother by her own father, and with each child she bore, the line between man and beast, family and sin, blurred further. The mountains remembered, even when the townsfolk tried to forget, and in the hollows where her story began, her name still lingers like smoke that never clears. The father's name has been mostly lost to time. In some tellings of the tale, he is called Ezra, in others Amos, and in a few old church records, his name flickers briefly before vanishing beneath ink blots and torn pages. What people remembered, more clearly than his name, was the way he carried himself. Tall, wiry, with shoulders bent not from weakness, but from a life of toil in the timber camps and the mines. His face was weathered, lined deep by sun and sorrow, and his eyes, once blue and steady, had turned to a gray that seemed to drink in light and give nothing back. When Ezra's wife died, it broke something inside him. A man in the mountains is often measured by how he keeps his family together against hardship, and when he lost her, he lost the only thing that tied him to the community. He abandoned the hymns, abandoned Sunday visits to town, abandoned the neighborly ways that might have tethered him to others. He chose instead to sink into the forest, pulling Lila with him as though she were nothing more than an extension of his grief. Some said he could not bear to lose her too, that he clung to her with a desperation that smothered her childhood. Others whispered that the shadow of sin had entered him long before, and his wife's death only gave it room to grow. Ezra worked the land hard, cutting trees, setting traps, tending to a small patch of corn and beans. Lila worked beside him, silent and obedient, her hands raw, and her back bent long before her time. The neighbors who saw them at the trading post noted how she never strayed more than a step from him, how he would grip her shoulder or her wrist as though she might vanish if he let go. They said it wasn't the grip of a father, but of something else, though no one dared put such thoughts into words. Inside the cabin, the shadow deepened. Nights stretched long, with only the firelight painting shapes on the walls. The silence between them was thick, not the comfortable silence of kin, but the suffocating silence of things unspoken. Ezra had turned inward so far that he no longer saw the boundary between father and husband, between protector and possessor. Folklore says the devil himself walks the ridges of Appalachia, whispering temptations into lonely ears. Some claim Ezra listened to those whispers, others that he needed no devil at all. The darkness came from his own heart. The first time he laid hands on Lila in that way, she was still more child than woman. She did not fight, not because she accepted, but because resistance in those mountains was a luxury. The nearest sheriff was days away, the nearest preacher even farther. Neighbors had long since stopped calling, and the world outside the cabin had shrunk to a size no larger than Ezra's shadow. For Lila, silence was survival, and in silence she endured. As the seasons passed, Ezra's control grew ironclad. He decided when she ate, when she spoke, when she slept. He watched her every movement with eyes sharp as a hawk's, not out of care but out of possession. When she began to show the signs of her first pregnancy, he forbade her from speaking of it, even when neighbors noticed her absence. He crafted stories with a calmness that chilled the bone, tales of illness, of visiting distant kin, of tending to the cabin during harsh storms. And the few who suspected chose to look away, for suspicion was easier to live with than confirmation. Lila bore her first child in that cabin, with no midwife, no neighborly women to guide her, only Ezra's rough hands and the suffocating silence of the mountains. Folklore says the walls shook that night, that the wind screamed down the hollow like a woman in labor herself, and that the child's first cry was swallowed so quickly by the forest that even the owls grew still. Lila's body was broken, her spirit more so, Yet Ezra looked upon the child with something that was not shame, but pride. After that, there was no return. What began as a trespass became a cycle. Each year seemed to carve her deeper into silence, each child pulling her further into the shadow of her father. People in town began to notice strange patterns. Lila grew pale, worn, then vanished for long stretches. Ezra appeared alone, grim-faced, with bundles of pelts or sacks of corn to trade, never explaining, never answering questions. The whispers grew bolder, though always behind closed doors. "It ain't right," the women muttered. "The Lord sees what's done in that cabin." Yet no one walked up the hollow to confront him. Fear kept them at bay, the kind of fear born not just of Ezra himself, but of the mountain's silence, which seemed complicit in the sin. Lila's eyes were what betrayed her most. Once, when she was 17, she came into town with Ezra to trade for sugar and flour. A neighbor's wife caught her gaze and saw something in it that made her heart stutter. It was not defiance, not even sorrow, but a hollow emptiness, as if the soul inside had retreated far away. That woman told others later that she could not shake the image, that she dreamed of Lila's gray eyes staring at her from the dark of her own bedroom. Ezra grew older, his beard streaked with white, his back bent by years of labor. But his shadow only stretched longer over Lila. He seemed to believe the children she bore him were proof of something, proof that the world had not abandoned him, proof that he could carve his own bloodline into the mountains themselves. What others saw as sin, he twisted into legacy, and though the whispers grew, they never reached his ears. Or if they did, he simply ignored them, trusting that the mountain's silence would protect him longer than any law could. In the hollows of Appalachia, shadows last longer than daylight, stretching across generations. Ezra's shadow was one such darkness, and though his body would one day return to the soil, the stain of what he did lingered, carved into the folklore of the mountains, a story too heavy to be carried in daylight but too haunting to be forgotten at night. Lila grew into womanhood in silence, and that silence became her only armor. It was not the peaceful quiet of a mountain stream or the gentle hush of snowfall. It was a silence forged in fear, heavy and suffocating, swallowing her voice before it ever reached her lips. From the outside she seemed obedient, reserved, a daughter who never argued with her father. But behind that quiet lay the truth. Her voice had been stolen from her long before she understood what it meant to have one. The people in town remembered the way she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, as though she was afraid of seeing too much, or of being seen herself. A child learns early how to read danger, and Lila had grown expert at it. She measured the weight of Ezra's footsteps before he entered a room. She counted the seconds of silence between his words. She studied the way his jaw clenched when anger stirred. To the neighbors, she was simply a shy girl, but to Lila, silence was survival. Speaking, even in small ways, risked drawing his wrath. Her silence deepened after the birth of her first child. She did not dare speak of the pain that split her body, nor of the horror that split her soul. She nursed the infant in shadows, listening to the creek outside the cabin run endlessly, as though mocking her with its freedom. When the child cried, she hushed him quickly, terrified the sound would carry too far down the hollow. She learned to rock a cradle with one hand and tend to the fire with the other, all without a word leaving her lips. Ezra, for his part, seemed content with this voiceless devotion, treating her silence not as suffering but as obedience. The silence grew louder in her second pregnancy. She carried the child with a quiet dread that clung to her like smoke. Some say she tried once to tell a neighbor during a rare visit to town. She had stepped away from Ezra for only a moment, her eyes darting toward a woman she knew from childhood. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Ezra's shadow fell across her again, and whatever words had risen within her sank back down, swallowed whole. The woman later swore she had seen a plea in Lila's eyes, a scream locked behind them. But a glance from Ezra was enough to silence her, too. No one asked, no one interfered. And so, silence spread like rot through the hollow. The children of her silence grew up half wild, half hidden. They played near the creek, but only within sight of the cabin. Their laughter was muffled, their questions unanswered. Ezra insisted they were kin from elsewhere, orphans taken in by his generosity. Few believed him, but none dared challenge him outright. The mountain people lived by a code of distance. Minding one's own business was often the difference between peace and bloodshed. And besides, what proof did anyone have? Only Lila's silence, and silence was not enough to condemn a man. Inside her, though, the silence became unbearable. Folklore says Lila sometimes went down to the creek alone after the children slept and whispered to the water. No one could hear what she said, if anything, but those who passed by claimed the current seemed louder on those nights, as if carrying secrets away into the dark. Some believed she prayed, though not to God, for she had long since ceased expecting mercy from him, but to the mountains themselves, begging them to bear witness. And perhaps they did. For in those years, strange signs began to ripple through the hollow. A black snake appeared on the doorstep each spring, coiled and waiting. The corn withered before harvest, even as the fields beyond thrived. An owl took to roosting in the rafters of the barn, its wide eyes watching each birth, each death, each sin committed beneath that roof. The old women in town muttered that the land itself knew what was happening, that Lila's silence was feeding, a curse deeper than any spoken word could. But to Lila, the curse was not in the land. It was in her own body, in the children she bore, who were both hers and not hers, both innocent and marked. Each time she felt a child stir within her silence deepened, as though her very soul sank lower with the weight. She never held them with the warmth of a mother's joy, though she never abandoned them either. She cared for them as best she could, feeding them, clothing them, watching them with eyes dulled by resignation. Yet deep inside, a scream pressed against her chest, a scream that never passed her lips. Some versions of the story say that once, just once, she did scream. That one winter night, after her third child was born, she carried the infant out to the porch, wrapped in a quilt, and looked up at the frozen stars. And there, with no one to hear but the mountains, she let out a cry so sharp it cut through the stillness like a blade. Neighbors 2 miles away claimed they heard something that night, though they swore it sounded less like a woman's cry and more like a panther's wail. But whether she truly screamed or not, by dawn she had returned, to silence, rocking the child in her arms as though nothing had happened. In time, silence became her identity. The children grew, Ezra aged, but Lila's voice never returned. She became a ghost even while alive, drifting through the cabin, her footsteps soft, her words non-existent. The townsfolk remembered her as the girl who never spoke, the woman whose eyes held secrets they dared not name. But in the hollows, her silence was louder than words. It was a testimony carved in shadows, a tale that would echo long after her lips had closed forever. The children came one after another, like seasons repeating without end. Each time Lila swelled with life, her silence grew heavier, and each time she brought forth a child, the hollow seemed to darken. These were not ordinary births, for though the infants were innocent, their blood carried the weight of sin. They were children of the same father and grandfather, born into a world already whispering against them. The first boy, pale and solemn, grew quiet as the woods themselves. He rarely cried, rarely laughed, and when he spoke, his words came out in short, clipped phrases, as though language itself was a burden. Neighbors who caught a glimpse of him said he looked too much like Ezra. Same gray eyes, same narrow jaw. A man could pretend a child was kin, but he could not hide the mirror of his own face. Some folks looked once at the boy and never looked again, unwilling to acknowledge what that resemblance meant. The second child was a girl, small and frail, with a birthmark spread across her shoulder like a handprint. Some said it was the devil's mark, others that it was a curse placed by the mountains themselves. She grew sick often, her breath shallow, her skin clammy, and yet she lingered, clinging to life as though unwilling to leave her mother alone in that cabin. Lila cared for her tenderly, rocking her through fevered nights, whispering prayers she dared not speak aloud in daylight. Ezra never spoke of the child's weakness, as though to admit it would mean admitting something deeper. The third and fourth children came quickly, boys both, and with them the whispers in town grew sharper. Ezra continued his lies, telling folks they were kinfolk's orphans, but the pattern was too obvious. Each child carried features too close to his own. Each return to town showed Lila thinner, more hollow-eyed, while Ezra's pride seemed to harden like stone. The people muttered, but they did not act. Mountain folk lived by silence as much as Lila did. To intervene was to invite trouble, and trouble was something no one wanted in a land where survival itself was already fragile. Yet the children carried the truth in their very bodies. Folklore says some were born with eyes that shifted strange, in the light, or with limbs that bent unnaturally, or with tempers that flared without cause. Others appeared normal enough but grew into odd ways, talking to themselves, wandering into the woods for hours, refusing to sleep under a roof. Each child seemed touched by something that was not of this world, as though the blood that bound them twisted their very nature. The old women whispered that the land itself would not accept such children, that they were marked before they even took their first breath. Still, Lila loved them, in her own quiet way. They were her torment and her only solace, her reminders of sin and her reasons to endure. She fed them, clothed them, held them close when storms rattled the cabin. Yet she knew what the world would see in them. She saw it in the way neighbors stared too long, in the way children in town whispered behind their hands. Her own children would be outcasts before they were even grown, their blood condemning them to a life of suspicion and shame. Ezra seemed blind to this. To him, the children were proof of his strength, proof that he had carved a legacy out of silence and sin. He carried himself with a grim pride, daring anyone to question him. When neighbors avoided his eyes, he saw it as respect, not fear. When they whispered, he dismissed it as envy. The more the world recoiled, the more he seemed to cling to the children as a twisted triumph. But the mountains saw what he refused to see. The hollow grew restless, its silence no longer the calm of solitude, but the tension before a storm. Wolves prowled closer to the cabin. Owls cried at odd hours, their voices echoing through the trees. Some said the children were marked not only by blood but by the mountains themselves, that the land had taken notice and would one day demand payment. In Appalachian lore, sins of the flesh were never hidden forever. The earth remembered, the rivers carried whispers, and the wind spread them farther than any human tongue. As the children grew, their strangeness only deepened. One boy refused to sleep indoors, curling instead beneath the porch like a dog. Another spoke of hearing voices in the woods, voices that called him by name. The frail girl with the birthmark often stared at nothing for hours, her lips moving silently, as though she conversed with someone only she could see. Neighbors who heard such stories shook their heads, muttering about curses, about bloodlines that should never have crossed. Yet no one acted. The children were left to wander the hollow, half wild, their laughter mingling with the cries of hawks overhead. They were both feared and pitied, both innocent and condemned, and always behind. Them was Lila's silence, her eyes watching, her lips pressed shut, her heart a prison of love and despair. She knew their blood was wrong, but she also knew they were hers, and that truth bound her as tightly as her father's shadow did. In time, the children themselves began to feel the weight of that silence. They asked questions she could not answer, questions about fathers and mothers, about why they never saw other kin, about why the neighbors looked at them with such strange eyes. Lila could only bow her head, unable to speak the truth. Her silence became their inheritance, passed down as surely as their blood. And so, the cabin in the hollow filled with children who were siblings and cousins, sons and grandsons, daughters and granddaughters all at once. Their laughter rang against the walls, but it was laughter edged with something uncanny. Their cries pierced the night, echoing down the creek until even the trees seemed to shiver. They were children of the same blood, born of a silence too deep to break, destined to carry their mother's burden into the folklore of the mountains. The mountains have a long memory. They do not forget the footsteps that walk their ridges or the cries that rise from their hollows. Long after human voices fade, the earth keeps record, and those who break the oldest laws of blood and kin find their sins echoing in strange and terrible ways. For the Whitakers, that echo came as whispers of a curse. At first it was only small things, the kind of misfortunes any family might suffer. The corn withered in its stalks before harvest, though neighbors' fields flourished. A cow died suddenly, eyes wide, tongue blackened, as if poisoned by nothing but the air itself. The children caught fevers that burned high and strange, and though they survived, they carried a restlessness afterward, their eyes darting toward shadows, their ears pricked for voices no one else could hear. Then came the animals. A black snake appeared each spring, coiling across the cabin threshold, its scales glinting like oil. Ezra killed it the first year, chopping it clean in two, but the next spring it returned, whole again, as though death itself could not rid the hollow of its warning. An owl took to roosting in the rafters, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. It did not fly when the children ran beneath it, nor when Ezra threw stones. Its gaze was steady, judgmental, as if it carried the weight of something greater than itself. The neighbors noticed too. They began to whisper not only of sin, but of spirits. In the Appalachian Mountains, every ridge and creek has a story. Ghosts of drowned women, headless soldiers, witches who wander in search of blood. Folks said the Whitaker cabin was marked now, that the land itself bore witness to what had been done inside its walls. A few claimed to see figures near the creek at night, shapes of women, pale and thin, drifting like smoke. Others swore they heard babies crying from the woods, though no child was missing. The hollow, once merely a place of silence, grew heavy with dread. Lila felt it most keenly. Alone at night, she heard voices pressing against the cabin walls, whispers woven into the wind, calling her name in tones both tender and cruel. Sometimes she woke to find her children standing at the foot of her bed, eyes wide, murmuring words that made no sense. They spoke of women in the trees, of shadows that moved when the fire burned low, of hands reaching from the creek. Ezra silenced them with his glare, but Lila felt the truth in their words. The curse was not rumor. It was real, curling tighter around her with each passing year. The frail daughter with the birthmark seemed most touched by it. She wandered the woods for hours, sometimes barefoot, sometimes humming songs no one had taught her. When Lila asked where she had gone, the girl only smiled and said, "Mama, the women wanted to see me." Ezra struck her for such words, but the girl did not flinch. Her silence afterward was not Lila's silence. It was something stranger, as though she had learned to listen to voices no one else could hear. By then, the townsfolk had stopped visiting altogether. They crossed themselves when they spoke of the Whitakers, muttering that God's judgment was already upon them. Some called it a curse, others a punishment. But no one dared walk the hollow after dark, and few even in daylight. The cabin became a mark of dread, a place pointed to but never approached. The children grew up half wild, half haunted, their faces pale against the dark trees, their laughter echoing like a chorus of ghosts. Folklore says the land itself began to reject the family. The well water turned foul, tasting of iron and rot. The fields yielded nothing but weeds, though the soil had once been fertile. Wolves prowled near the cabin even in daylight, unafraid of men, their eyes reflecting a strange light. Some swore they were not wolves at all, but spirits wearing wolfskin, circling, waiting. Lila, exhausted and hollow, saw in every shadow a judgment she could not escape. Ezra, though, remained unmoved. He denied the curse, denied the whispers, denied everything but his own will. To him, the mountain was not punishing, but resisting, and he believed his stubbornness would outlast it. He forbade the children from speaking of spirits, forbade Lila from praying, forbade anything that acknowledged the weight pressing down upon them. His denial was a fortress, but it was a fragile one, and the cracks showed in his eyes. He aged quickly, his hair whitening, his body stooping, but his pride only sharpened, like a blade that cuts even as it rusts. For Lila, there was no such shield. She carried the curse in her silence, in her body, in the children who bore the weight of both her love and her sin. At night, she dreamed of the hollow rising up to swallow her, of roots tangling her ankles, of water filling her lungs. She woke gasping, clutching her chest, the children's pale faces hovering in the dark. She began to wonder if her silence had birthed not only children, but spirits themselves, voices that would haunt her long after death. In the mountains, curses are not simply tales. They live in the soil, in the wind, in the hearts of those who carry them. And so the Whitakers became less a family and more a legend in the making, a story whispered around fires, a warning carved into memory. The mountain's curse was not only on Ezra, not only on Lila, but on every child born beneath that roof. They were bound to it as surely as they were bound to each other, and no prayer, no silence, no denial could free them. Secrets rot when they are kept too long, and the Whitaker cabin had become a vault filled with them. Every wall, every board, every rafter seemed steeped in the weight of things unspoken. The smell of smoke clung not just from the hearth, but from the very air, as if the house itself sweated with guilt. The children grew older, their strangeness sharpening with each year, and with them grew the risk that what had been hidden would finally be dragged into daylight. It began with questions. The older boys, lanky and restless, wandered farther down the hollow. They spoke with children from town, and in their words and bearing the truth began to show. One had Ezra's piercing gray eyes, another his sharp jaw, and though mountain folk were used to families resembling one another, there was something too exact in the likeness. Brothers? People asked. Cousins? Ezra's stories grew harder to maintain, and his eyes grew harder when suspicion lingered too long. The girls, too, carried signs of the truth. The frail daughter with the birthmark moved like a shadow, her gaze always turned inward, lips mumbling in ways that frightened neighbors when they glimpsed her. Another girl bore hair as dark as Lila's had been in childhood, but her face mirrored Ezra's so clearly that one neighbor's wife gasped aloud when she saw her at the trading post. Ezra silenced that visit quickly, dragging the girl home before another word could be spoken. But gossip, once sparked, is a fire that never goes out. Whispers began spreading through the town. People spoke in kitchens and on porches, never too loudly, but with a certainty that grew heavier each time. He's got those children by her, they muttered. Ain't no orphans, ain't no cousins. Some said they'd known it all along. Others claimed to have seen proof in the children's faces. The preacher's wife called it an abomination, while old men spat tobacco and muttered that it was the devil's work. But though the talk grew, no one climbed the hollow to confront Ezra. Fear still outweighed outrage, yet secrets demand air. They cannot be smothered forever, and the first true crack came not from the townsfolk but from within the cabin itself. One of the boys, barely 12, slipped into town one evening, hungry for company beyond the cabin walls. He spoke to other children, and in his innocence, he said too much. He spoke of how Papa is Grandpa too, of how Mama don't talk, of how the owls watch them at night. The other children laughed, thinking it a strange tale spun for attention, but one of their mothers overheard. By the next morning, the story had circled half the town. Ezra heard of it soon after. His fury shook the cabin. The boy was beaten until he could not rise, and Lila, silent as always, watched with tears streaming, but no words to stop it. Ezra cursed the townsfolk, cursed their gossip, cursed even the mountains themselves. He swore that no one would take his family from him, that no sheriff, no preacher, no neighbor had the right. Yet in his rage, he revealed his fear. He knew the story had traveled too far to be buried again. That winter, the cabin became a prison, more than ever. Ezra forbade the children from leaving, boarding the windows, locking the door with iron latches he had forged himself. Lila tended the fire, cooked what little food remained, and watched her children with a sorrow so deep it hollowed her out. The children, restless and growing, pressed against their confinement. They whispered among themselves, sometimes speaking, words that made no sense to Lila, fragments of voices, strange songs, dreams they all seemed to share. The curse of the mountains mingled with the curse of their blood, weaving a net that bound them tighter each day. Outside, the neighbors debated. Some wanted to climb the hollow, to drag Ezra before the law, to take Lila and the children away from him. Others warned against it, saying no good would come of stirring such sin. The preacher preached sermons of Lot's daughters, of God's wrath upon those who defied his laws, but still no one acted. Fear of Ezra's temper, fear of curses, fear of what they might truly find in that cabin kept them frozen. But the cabin itself seemed to grow restless. At night, lights flickered in the windows, though no lamp burned. Some swore they heard cries carried down the hollow, though no one dared follow them to the source. Hunters avoided the ridge, claiming they saw figures moving between trees, though. The woods were empty. The Whitaker cabin had become more than a home. It had become a place where secrets festered until they bled into the land itself. Folklore says one night, in the dead of winter, a trader passing through knocked on the cabin door. He was met not with welcome but with silence so deep it chilled him. He claimed later he heard whispers behind the door, children's voices speaking in unison, but when Ezra opened, there was only darkness behind him. The trader left quickly and never returned, swearing that the cabin did not house a family, but something else entirely. The truth of the Whitakers, Ezra's shadow, Lila's silence, the children of the same blood, was no longer hidden. It pressed against the walls, seeped into the town, and etched itself into the memory of everyone who lived within earshot of the hollow. Blood kept in the cabin cannot remain there forever. It spills, and once spilled, it stains everything it touches. And so the legend grew heavier, darker, ready to cross from whispered suspicion into undeniable truth. The end of the Whitaker tale did not come with a single moment of thunder and fire, but with a slow unraveling, as though the very mountains grew tired of holding their secret. By the spring after the trader's frightful visit, the air around the hollow had changed. Neighbors said the birds no longer sang there, that even the wind seemed unwilling to pass through. The children, now older and restless, began appearing at the edges of town in ways they had not before, slipping from their father's watch for brief hours. Their faces, too alike, too uncanny, set tongues wagging with a fever no one could calm. One girl, nearly grown, was seen in the preacher's yard. She asked for bread, her voice soft and cracked from disuse. The preacher's wife pressed the loaf into her hands and swore she felt the girl's skin burn like fever under her touch. That evening, the preacher rode hard to the sheriff, demanding that something be done. The sheriff, reluctant, rode with him up the hollow, but when they reached the cabin, Ezra stood waiting on the porch with his rifle. His face was gray with age, his eyes bright with fury, and behind him in the dim doorway, the children's eyes glowed like the reflection of firelight. Neither law nor scripture had the courage to press farther. They turned back, and in their retreat the legend rooted itself deeper. But legends cannot remain static. They grow, twist, and bloom into something larger than the truth that birthed them. By midsummer, rumors claimed that Ezra had died and yet still walked the cabin halls. Others swore Lila had taken her children and fled into the mountains, where their bloodline mixed with wild things and spirits of the old woods. Hunters whispered of pale figures glimpsed at night, their faces familiar but not human, their laughter echoing where no living soul could be. The cabin itself became the heart of the story. Some claimed it was found abandoned one autumn, its hearth cold, its table still set with rotting food. Others said smoke rose from its chimney for years after, though no one dared climb close enough to confirm. A few brave, or foolish, boys crept near in search of proof and returned shaken, insisting they had heard children's voices humming the same tune over and over, though the cabin had been locked tight and empty. Whether those boys lied or whether they truly brushed against something left behind, none could say. Lila's fate became the greatest question of all. In some versions of the tale, she wasted away in the cabin, her silence finally consuming her until she was little more than a ghost herself. In others, she escaped one night with her youngest, trudging barefoot across the ridge until she disappeared into Tennessee, where she lived nameless in another valley. Some storytellers insist she wanders still, her mouth stitched by sorrow, carrying the faces of her children in the lines of her eyes. Whichever ending is told, it is always the same. She was a woman both pitied and cursed, bound by blood she never chose, and remembered for sins not her own. As for the children, the versions splinter into endless shapes. Some say they died within the cabin, claimed by sickness born of their own blood. Others believe they scattered into the hills, founding strange and twisted branches of kin that still linger in Appalachia, marked by odd ways and stranger looks. A few swear the children never died at all, but walked the woods as eternal things, half spirit and half human, forever whispering the secret of their birth to the trees. And so the Whitaker name was erased from records but carved into memory. No gravestones bear it, no Bible keeps it, yet the people of the mountains repeat it in hushed tones. Around firesides, parents warn their young not to wander alone, lest they meet the children of the same blood. Preachers thunder from pulpits about the wages of sin, weaving Ezra's shadow into sermons about Lot, about Cain, about every cursed soul who defied God's order. Hunters mutter it when they hear strange cries on a moonless night. The story has shifted so often that no one remembers what parts are true, and perhaps that is the truest fate of all, to become more legend than life. Today, the hollow is overgrown. The path is little more than a deer trail, choked by ivy and brambles. Some say the cabin still stands, sagging but stubborn, its windows black as empty sockets. Others claim it fell to ash long ago. But ask the old folk, the ones who still know the hills as their ancestors did, and they will tell you plain, whether the boards remain or not, the cabin has never left. It is there in the silence, in the weight of the air, in the way the wind falters as it crosses the ridge. It is there in the bloodline of those who never left Appalachia, who carry something unspoken in their eyes. She gave birth to her father's children, the tale ends, always with that same line. And no matter how it is told, whether with pity for Lila, horror at Ezra, or fear of the children, the mountain folk nod gravely, as though the story is not mere invention but a truth etched into the soil. Because in the Appalachians, truth and folklore walk hand in hand, and the most forbidden daughter of them all has never truly been forgotten.